Deep beneath the surface of the earth, where sunlight has never touched stone and silence becomes a living thing, lies a world that most people will never see. This is the domain of the speleologist, the cave explorer, where every breath of air is precious and every step could be your last. What I'm about to tell you is the story of one man's descent into the abyss, a journey that began with excitement and discovery, but ended in a way that still haunts the caving community today. This is the story of Marcus Weber, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Caving isn't just about wandering through underground passages with a headlamp. It's a discipline that demands respect, preparation, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Every piece of equipment matters. Every rope, every anchor point, every knot tied in the darkness could mean the difference between making it home or becoming another cautionary tale whispered around the campfires of outdoor adventure clubs. Marcus Weber understood this better than most. At 34 years old, he was what the caving community would call a veteran. He'd been exploring underground systems for over 15 years, starting as a curious teenager who stumbled upon his first cave entrance during a family camping trip in the Austrian Alps. That initial taste of the underground world had hooked him completely. By the time our story takes place, Marcus had descended into some of the most challenging cave systems across Europe. He'd navigated the treacherous waters of flooded passages, squeezed through gaps so narrow that claustrophobia would have paralyzed most people, and rappelled down vertical shafts that plunged hundreds of meters into the Earth's belly. His logbook read like a catalog of underground achievements, each entry documenting another successful exploration, another system mapped, another personal limit pushed just a little bit further. What made Marcus particularly respected among his peers wasn't just his technical skill, though that was considerable. It was his methodical approach to safety. He was the kind of speleologist who would spend hours inspecting every piece of gear before a descent. He'd run his fingers along every millimeter of rope, checking for nicks, frays, or weak spots that could spell disaster hundreds of feet underground. His anchor points were always redundant, his emergency protocols rehearsed until they became muscle memory. This obsession with preparation had saved his life more than once. There was the time in Slovenia when a rockfall blocked his primary exit route, forcing him to navigate an alternative passage he'd scouted weeks earlier, or the incident in Germany where his primary headlamp failed in a complex maze of tunnels, but his backup systems and methodical approach to navigation got him out safely. These experiences had only reinforced his belief that in caving there was no such thing as being too careful. The cave system that would become the setting for this tragic story was located in the remote mountains of Switzerland, about 2 hours' drive from the nearest town. The locals called it Höhlenloch, which translates roughly to Hell's Hole. It wasn't a name chosen for dramatic effect. The cave had earned its ominous title through decades of challenging even the most experienced cavers who dared to explore its depths. Höhlenloch was what speleologists call a vertical system. Rather than the horizontal passages and gradually descending chambers that characterize many cave networks, this was essentially a series of shafts that dropped straight down into the mountain. The entrance itself was unremarkable, just a crack in the limestone about the width of a person's shoulders. But that crack opened into a void, that plunged over 300 meters into the earth. The cave had been discovered in the 1960s by a team of Swiss explorers, but it had never been fully mapped. Previous expeditions had reached various depths, with the deepest recorded descent stopping at around 250 meters. The problem wasn't just the technical challenge of the vertical drops. Hulenloch was also notorious for its unstable rock formations and unpredictable air currents that could make rope work treacherous. Marcus had been planning his expedition to Hulenloch for over 6 months. He'd studied every available report, talked to cavers who had attempted the system before, and even made several reconnaissance trips to the area just to familiarize himself with the surface terrain and access routes. This wasn't going to be a casual weekend adventure. This was a serious attempt to push deeper into the cave than anyone had gone before. For this expedition, Marcus had assembled what he considered to be the finest equipment available. His ropes were rated for forces far exceeding anything he expected to encounter. His descenders and ascenders were top of the line models that he'd tested extensively in controlled environments. His anchor systems were engineered with multiple redundancies, designed to hold even if several components failed simultaneously. The plan was ambitious, but carefully structured. Marcus would descend in stages, establishing camps at various depths where he could rest, check his equipment, and assess conditions before continuing deeper. Each stage would be thoroughly documented with detailed measurements and photographs that would contribute to the first comprehensive map of the system's full depth. On the morning of September 15th, Marcus loaded his gear into his van and began the drive to Hulenloch. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and stable conditions expected for the next several days. He'd chosen this timing deliberately, knowing that any storm activity could create dangerous conditions in the cave's vertical shafts. The approach to the cave entrance required a 2-hour hike through alpine terrain, carrying all his equipment in specialized packs designed for technical caving. By the time Marcus reached the entrance crack, he was already feeling the weight of his gear, but his excitement was palpable. This was what he lived for, the moment when months of planning and preparation finally translated into action. Setting up his first anchor point, Marcus methodically inspected every component of his rigging system. The limestone around the cave entrance was solid, offering multiple options for secure anchor placements. He established his primary anchor using expansion bolts drilled deep into the rock, then created a backup system using natural rock features and additional hardware. Everything looked perfect. Before beginning his descent, Marcus conducted one final equipment check. His ropes were properly coiled and free of tangles. His descender was correctly rigged and functioning smoothly. His emergency ascenders were positioned for quick access if needed. His headlamp batteries were fresh, with multiple backups secured in waterproof containers. Every contingency he could imagine had been planned for and prepared against. At exactly 10:47 a.m., Marcus clipped into his descent system and began backing toward the edge of the entrance crack. The initial drop was only about 20 meters to the first ledge, where he planned to pause and assess conditions before continuing into the main shaft. As he leaned back into his harness and felt the rope take his full weight, everything felt solid and secure. The descent began smoothly, Marcus controlled his speed carefully, using his descender to maintain a steady pace as he dropped through the entrance shaft. The walls around him were smooth limestone, polished by centuries of water flow, and his headlamp beam revealed the elegant formations that made vertical caving so captivating. Reaching the first ledge, Marcus took a moment to appreciate his surroundings. Below him, his headlamp beam disappeared into darkness, unable to illuminate the bottom of the shaft that would carry him deeper into Höhlenloch than any previous explorer had ventured. Above him, the entrance crack showed as a narrow rectangle of daylight, already seeming impossibly distant. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. His equipment was performing flawlessly. The cave conditions were ideal, and Marcus felt that familiar surge of anticipation that came with pushing into unexplored territory. He had no way of knowing that 90 meters deeper into the mountain, a microscopic flaw in one of his ropes was about to change everything. After a brief rest and equipment check on the first ledge, Marcus prepared to continue his descent into the main shaft. The section ahead would be the most challenging part of his planned route, a nearly vertical drop of over 200 meters through what previous explorers had described as a cathedral-like chamber. Marcus had studied the reports from earlier expeditions extensively. The main shaft was known for its impressive dimensions, with walls that opened into a vast underground space. At certain points, the chamber was wide enough that a headlamp beam couldn't reach the opposite walls. It was the kind of formation that made speleologists feel simultaneously humbled and exhilarated, a reminder of the incredible forces that had carved these spaces over millions of years. Setting up his rigging for the main descent required careful attention to rope management. Marcus was using a technique called pitch rigging, where longer sections of rope are deployed to handle extended vertical drops. His primary rope for this section was a 11 millimeter dynamic line, specifically designed for the demands of vertical caving. The rope had been manufactured just 8 months earlier and had seen limited use on previous expeditions. What Marcus couldn't see, even with his methodical inspection routine, was happening at the molecular level within the rope's core. During a previous expedition to a cave system in Austria, the rope had been subjected to a sharp edge loading scenario when it rubbed against a jagged limestone protrusion. The contact had been brief, lasting only seconds, and had left no visible damage on the rope's outer sheath. But beneath that protective outer layer, several of the rope's core strands had sustained microscopic damage. The sharp limestone had created tiny stress concentrations in the nylon fibers, invisible to the naked eye, but significant enough to reduce the rope's overall strength. Under normal circumstances, even this damaged rope would have been more than capable of handling Marcus's body weight and the dynamic forces of a controlled descent. However, rope failure is rarely about normal circumstances. It's about the convergence of multiple factors, each seemingly minor on its own, but potentially catastrophic when combined. The damaged core strands were the first factor. The second was the specific loading pattern that would occur during Marcus's descent through the main shaft. As Marcus began his descent into the cathedral chamber, he was immediately struck by the scale of the space around him. His headlamp beam revealed limestone formations that seemed to flow like frozen waterfalls, carved by ancient water flows that had long since found new paths through the mountain. The walls were adorned with calcite deposits that caught his light and reflected it in crystalline patterns that transformed the darkness into something almost magical. The descent was proceeding smoothly, with Marcus maintaining his usual careful pace. He paused periodically to photograph the formations around him, documenting features that no one had seen from this perspective before. Each photo would eventually contribute to the scientific understanding of the cave system, adding to the knowledge base that helped other explorers plan their own expeditions. At the 40-meter mark, Marcus encountered his first significant challenge. The main shaft narrowed considerably, creating what cavers call a restriction. The walls closed in from both sides, forcing him to navigate through a gap that was barely wide enough for his body and equipment. This type of formation was common in vertical systems, where water erosion had carved irregular patterns through the limestone. Navigating the restriction required Marcus to adjust his descent technique. Instead of the smooth, controlled rappel he'd been maintaining, he now had to work his way down in shorter stages, carefully positioning his body to avoid snagging his equipment on the rock protrusions. The process was slower and more physically demanding, requiring him to support his weight in awkward positions while maneuvering through the tight space. It was during this delicate navigation that the rope experienced its first significant stress event. As Marcus worked through the restriction, his rope became loaded against a sharp edge of limestone. The angle created what rope engineers call a high load factor, concentrating force on a small section of the rope rather than distributing it evenly along its length. Under normal circumstances, Marcus's rope would have handled this loading without any problems. But the microscopic damage from his previous expedition had created a weak point that was now experiencing maximum stress. The damaged nylon fibers began to separate at the molecular level, though the rope's outer sheath continued to appear completely normal. Clearing the restriction, Marcus found himself in a wider section of the shaft where the descent became more straightforward again. He was now approaching the 70-meter mark, deeper than most recreational cavers would ever venture. The air around him had grown noticeably cooler, and he could hear the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness below. This was the kind of environment that Marcus lived for, the complete isolation from the surface world, the sense of exploring spaces that existed in perfect darkness until his arrival, the technical challenge of navigating complex three-dimensional terrain using only rope systems and climbing techniques. Every aspect of the experience reinforced his passion for speleology and his drive to push deeper into unexplored territory. At the 80-meter mark, Marcus paused for another equipment check. This was part of his standard protocol for extended vertical descents, a safety practice that had become automatic after years of underground exploration. He tested his descender's operation, checked his backup ascenders, and verified that his headlamp was functioning properly. Everything appeared to be working perfectly. What Marcus couldn't detect was the progressive failure occurring within his rope. The damaged core strands were continuing to separate, reducing the rope's load-bearing capacity with each meter of descent. The process was invisible and silent, happening gradually enough that the rope continued to feel solid and reliable under normal loading conditions. The final 10 meters to the 90-meter mark took Marcus through another complex section of the shaft. The walls were decorated with flowstone formations that created a maze of obstacles requiring careful navigation. He had to thread his descent line through a series of natural arches and around protruding rock formations, each movement requiring precise control of his position and equipment. As Marcus approached the 90-meter depth, he was entering territory that few cavers had ever experienced. The pressure of the mountain above him was enormous, and the silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. His headlamp beam revealed that the shaft continued far below, disappearing into darkness that seemed to extend infinitely downward. It was at this moment, suspended 90 meters below the surface in the cathedral chamber of Hulenloch, that the accumulated damage to Marcus's rope reached its critical threshold. The remaining intact core strands were now carrying the full load of his descent, stressed beyond their design limits by the microscopic failures that had been propagating throughout the rope's structure. The failure, when it came, was instantaneous and complete. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard in 15 years of caving. Not the sharp crack of breaking rock or the grinding of shifting stone, but something softer, yet infinitely more terrifying. A whisper of separating fibers, barely audible above the ambient silence of the cave, followed immediately by the sickening sensation of free fall. For the first fraction of a second, Marcus's mind couldn't process what was happening. The rope that had been supporting his full weight just moments before was now trailing uselessly above him as he plummeted through the darkness of the cathedral chamber. His descender, still attached to the severed rope end, spun freely in his hand as gravity claimed him. Training kicked in faster than conscious thought. Marcus's hands moved instinctively toward his emergency ascenders, the backup devices that every experienced caver carries for exactly this type of catastrophic failure. But ascenders are designed to grip a rope under tension, and without a continuous line to attach to, they were useless pieces of metal in the darkness. The walls of the shaft rushed past him in a blur of limestone and shadow. His headlamp beam swept wildly through the chamber, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the formations that had captivated him just moments before. Now those same beautiful calcite deposits and flowstone cascades were potential impact points that could end his fall in the most violent way imaginable. Marcus's fall through the cathedral chamber lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched into an eternity of desperate calculation. His mind raced through every emergency protocol he'd ever learned, every rescue scenario he'd practiced, searching for some technique or procedure that could save him from the inevitable impact with the cave floor somewhere in the darkness below. Certes, the irony wasn't lost on him, even in those final moments of free fall. All his years of meticulous preparation, his obsessive attention to equipment maintenance, his redundant safety systems, none of it had accounted for this particular failure mode, this rope that had seemed so reliable during his pre-descent inspection had harbored a fatal flaw that no visual examination could have detected. As Marcus fell deeper into the shaft, his headlamp beam finally found the bottom. The cave floor rushed up toward him with terrifying speed, and he realized with crystal clarity that his 15-year journey through the underground world was about to end in the depths of Hulenloch. The impact, when it came, echoed through the cathedral chamber like thunder. Then silence returned to the cave, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water and the soft whisper of air currents moving through the limestone passages. Marcus Weber had become another name in the tragic history of vertical caving, another reminder of how quickly the underground world could claim even its most experienced explorers. Above ground, the autumn sun continued to shine on the Swiss mountains, completely indifferent to the tragedy that had just unfolded 90 meters below the surface. Marcus's van sat empty in the parking area where he'd left it that morning, and it would remain there for 3 days before anyone realized that something had gone wrong. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus failed to check in with his emergency contact, a fellow caver named Stefan who lived in Zurich. Marcus had been religious about his communication protocols, always calling or texting within 12 hours of completing a cave expedition. When 24 hours passed without any word, Stefan began making calls to other members of the Swiss caving community. The search and rescue operation that followed would become one of the most challenging cave recoveries in Swiss mountaineering history. The vertical nature of Höhlenloch made access extremely difficult, and the depth at which Marcus was located pushed the limits of even the most experienced rescue teams. It took nearly 18 hours of continuous work to establish safe rigging systems that could support a recovery operation at 90 meters depth. When the rescue team finally reached Marcus, they found him at the bottom of the cathedral chamber, surrounded by the limestone formations he had been photographing just before the rope failure. The scene told the story of what had happened with devastating clarity. The severed rope end was still attached to his descender, and the remainder of the line hung uselessly from the anchor point far above. The investigation into the rope failure would consume weeks of forensic analysis. Experts from rope manufacturers, climbing equipment companies, and rescue organizations all examined the failed line, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. The microscopic damage from Marcus's previous expedition was eventually identified, but only after extensive laboratory testing that revealed the molecular level failures in the rope's core structure. The findings sent shockwaves through the international caving community. Here was a rope that had appeared completely normal during visual inspection, manufactured by a reputable company and used well within its rated capacity, yet it had failed catastrophically when the accumulated damage reached a critical threshold. The incident forced a complete reevaluation of rope inspection protocols and safety procedures throughout the speleological world. Marcus's death highlighted one of the most unsettling aspects of technical caving. Despite all the safety equipment, backup systems, and emergency protocols, there remained failure modes that were essentially unpredictable and undetectable. The microscopic damage that caused his rope to fail could have happened to any caver on any expedition without leaving any visible evidence of the impending failure. The cave community's response to the tragedy was swift and comprehensive. New guidelines were developed for rope inspection, including recommendations for more frequent replacement of lines used in vertical systems. Equipment manufacturers began researching better methods for detecting internal damage to climbing ropes. Training programs were updated to include more detailed discussions of equipment failure scenarios. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological rather than technical. Marcus Weber's death served as a stark reminder that even the most experienced cavers with the best equipment and most meticulous preparation, remained vulnerable to the fundamental dangers of exploring the underground world. The mountain had claimed another life, not through any mistake or oversight on Marcus's part, but through the convergence of invisible factors that created a perfect storm of catastrophic failure. The memorial service for Marcus was held at a small church in the village nearest to Hulenloch, Wowit. Cavers from across Europe attended, sharing stories of Marcus's contributions to speleology and his passion for underground exploration. Many spoke about how his methodical approach to safety had inspired them to be more careful in their own expeditions, and how his death had reinforced their respect for the dangers they faced every time they descended below ground. Stefan, who had been Marcus's closest friend in the caving community, delivered the eulogy. He talked about Marcus's love for the underground world, his dedication to documenting and mapping cave systems, and his belief that the risks of speleology were worth taking in pursuit of scientific knowledge and personal discovery. But he also acknowledged the harsh reality that Marcus's death represented, the fact that sometimes the mountain simply wins, regardless of preparation or skill level. The story of Marcus Weber and his final descent into Hulenloch spread throughout the global caving community, becoming a case study in equipment failure and risk management. His death contributed to important advances in rope technology and safety protocols that have undoubtedly saved other lives. But for those who knew him personally, Marcus remained more than just a cautionary tale or a catalyst for safety improvements. He was a passionate explorer who had dedicated his life to understanding the hidden world beneath our feet, someone who had pushed the boundaries of human knowledge about cave systems while maintaining an almost obsessive commitment to safety. The fact that he died despite doing everything right only emphasized the inherent risks that every caver accepts when they clip into their gear and descend into the darkness. The investigation into Marcus's death revealed something that would haunt the caving community for years to come. When the rope manufacturer's engineers examined the failed line under electron microscopy, they discovered that the damage wasn't just from the single incident in Austria. The rope showed evidence of multiple microabrasion events, each one individually insignificant, but collectively creating a cascade of structural weakness that had been building for months. What made this discovery particularly unsettling was how common these types of loading scenarios were in vertical caving. Every time a rope contacted sharp limestone during a descent, every instance where a caver had to navigate around a protruding rock formation, every moment when the line was loaded against an edge, created the potential for this type of invisible damage. The rope that killed Marcus could have been any rope owned by any caver used in any cave system around the world. The forensic team also discovered something else that sent chills through the speleological community. Marcus's backup rope, carefully coiled and stored in his pack, showed similar microscopic damage patterns. If he had somehow survived the initial fall and attempted to use his emergency equipment, there was a significant possibility that his backup line would have failed as well. The revelation suggested that rope degradation from edge loading was far more common and dangerous than anyone had previously understood. Dr. Sarah Chen, a materials engineer who specialized in climbing equipment failure analysis, was brought in to lead the expanded investigation. Her team conducted extensive testing on ropes from caves across Europe, examining lines that appeared perfectly functional to the naked eye. The results were shocking. Nearly 30% of the ropes they tested showed some degree of internal damage, and 12% were compromised enough to fail under loads significantly lower than their rated capacity. The implications were staggering. Thousands of cavers were descending into vertical systems every year using ropes that might be harboring invisible structural weaknesses. The equipment that formed the literal lifeline between cavers and the surface world was potentially unreliable in ways that no existing inspection protocol could detect. Meanwhile, back at Höhenloch, the cave itself seemed to retreat into its ancient silence. The rescue operation had disturbed the delicate ecosystem of the cathedral chamber, and it would take months for the cave environment to return to its natural state. Local authorities placed temporary restrictions on access to the system, citing safety concerns and the need to complete their investigation without interference. But caves don't remain empty for long. Within weeks of the restrictions being lifted, other speleologists began planning their own expeditions to Höhenloch. Marcus's death hadn't diminished the cave's allure. If anything, it had enhanced its reputation as one of the most challenging vertical systems in Europe. The fact that it had claimed the life of such an experienced caver only added to its mystique among those who sought to test themselves against the most demanding underground environments. The first expedition to attempt Höhenloch after Marcus's death was led by a team of Italian cavers who had been following the investigation closely. They arrived with equipment that reflected the hard-learned lessons from the tragedy. Their ropes were replaced after every major expedition, regardless of apparent condition. They carried advanced inspection equipment, including portable ultrasonic devices that could detect internal damage invisible to visual examination. Most significantly, they used a completely redundant rope system with multiple independent lines capable of supporting their full weight throughout the descent. The Italian team successfully reached the 90-meter mark where Marcus had fallen, and they continued deeper into the system than any previous expedition. At 120 meters, they encountered a massive chamber that dwarfed even the cathedral space where Marcus had died. Their headlamps revealed formations that seemed to defy the laws of physics, limestone curtains so thin they were translucent, and flowstone cascades that had been growing for millions of years in perfect darkness. But even as they documented these incredible discoveries, the Italian cavers couldn't escape the shadow of Marcus's death. Every rope movement, every contact with the cave walls, every loading event that occurred during their descent was a reminder of how quickly the underground world could turn deadly. They completed their expedition successfully, but several team members later admitted that they had been more frightened during that descent than at any other time in their caving careers. The psychological impact of Marcus's death extended far beyond individual expeditions. Cave rescue organizations across Europe began reporting increased call volumes as cavers became more conservative about their risk tolerance. Expeditions that might have pushed deeper into unexplored territory were turning back earlier. Solo caving, never recommended but practiced by experienced cavers like Marcus, became virtually unheard of in the wake of the accident. Equipment manufacturers responded to the crisis by accelerating research into rope technology. New materials were developed that could better withstand edge loading scenarios. Advanced inspection techniques were refined to detect internal damage before it reached critical levels. Some companies began embedding electronic sensors in their ropes that could monitor structural integrity in real time during use. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than technological. The caving community had always maintained a careful balance between safety consciousness and the acceptance of inherent risk. Marcus's death forced a recalibration of that balance, pushing the community toward more conservative practices, even as it threatened to diminish the spirit of exploration that drew people to caving in the first place. The annual European Speleological Congress, held 6 months after Marcus's death, was dominated by discussions of rope safety and risk management. Presentations that in previous years might have focused on new discoveries and mapping achievements instead examined failure modes and safety protocols. The mood was somber, reflecting a community grappling with the realization that their fundamental understanding of equipment reliability had been flawed. During the Congress, Marcus's former expedition partner Stefan announced the establishment of the Weber Foundation, dedicated to advancing rope safety research and supporting the families of cavers killed in equipment related accidents. The Foundation's first initiative was a comprehensive database of rope failures designed to identify patterns and develop predictive models for equipment degradation. The Foundation's research revealed disturbing trends that extended well beyond caving. Rock climbers, rescue workers, and industrial rope access technicians were all potentially at risk from the same type of invisible damage that had killed Marcus. The problem wasn't limited to any single activity or environment. It was inherent in the way synthetic ropes responded to sharp edge loading over time. As the first anniversary of Marcus's death approached, the caving community prepared for a memorial expedition to Höhenloch. The plan was to descend to the 90-meter mark and conduct a ceremony honoring Marcus's contribution to speleology. But when the team arrived at the cave entrance, they found something unexpected. Marcus Weber's story serves as a haunting reminder that the underground world operates by its own unforgiving rules. Even the most prepared explorers, armed with years of experience and top-tier equipment, remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. His death revolutionized rope safety protocols and saved countless lives, but it also reminded us that some risks can never be eliminated entirely. The darkness below will always call to those brave enough to answer, and sometimes the mountain simply wins. If you found this story compelling, you might want to explore our other videos about extreme exploration gone wrong.